Hello, everyone. We're now continuing our series on the Bill of Rights. We heard a little bit about the history and how the Bill of Rights, or rather why the Bill of Rights came to be. It was to spell out our rights. Like, what can we do as American citizen people? So today we're going to focus on just the First Amendment, because it's a doozy. It's a big one. There's lots of things that are encompassed in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, namely freedom of religion and freedom of expression. So we're going to talk about how those things are protected by the First Amendment. And right off the bat, I worded the learning target a certain way for a reason. We don't have freedom of religion and freedom of expression because the First Amendment gives it to us. Oh, no, 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 no. The Bill of Rights does not give us our rights. Rights are things that we are born with. You have rights. They are yours, and no one else gives them to you because you are human. You have rights. They are part of you. Remember when we learned about the Declaration of Independence, how Thomas Jefferson said that we have certain unalienable rights, right? Unalienable meaning they can't be separated from you. And among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that was the Declaration of Independence, but the Constitution came by much later, and then the Bill of Rights was added later still. So it's the First Amendment that protects our right of freedom of religion and freedom of expression. It doesn't give it to us. We already had that right. It was James Madison and other early leaders who said, well, let's spell out the rights that we have for the people. So again, we don't receive freedom of religion from the First Amendment. We already have freedom of religion. The First Amendment just reminds us that we have it and protects it. It puts it in writing to make sure it's there, right? So let's start talking a little bit about freedom of religion and expression as it is written in the First Amendment. So the First Amendment literally says, this is part of it, okay? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So we're going to talk about those two phrases, respecting an establishment of religion and prohibiting the free exercise of religion. So we'll unpack what those mean here a little bit. First of all, this idea of an established religion means that there are countries around the world where certain religions are preferred or established by their government as the official religion of that country. And oftentimes people lose their rights. They miss out on opportunities and freedoms if they don't follow the same religion as the government. We saw this play out with the Pilgrims. If we go back to the Thanksgiving story, it was the Puritans living in England who were being persecuted. They were being tortured. They were thrown in jail and killed because their religious beliefs were a little bit different than the king's. And so the king said, get out of my country. And the Puritans said, don't mind if we do. And so they sailed across the ocean in the Mayflower, and they landed at Plymouth Rock. And the rest is history with the Thanksgiving story, both the good and the bad that comes from that. But the Puritans left England because they wanted to practice their religion the way they wanted to, rather than be told how to do it by the king. And so whenever there's an established religion, it means that the government of that country decides what everybody's religion should be. And if people don't follow that religion, there could be consequences. So our First Amendment says we're not going to do that. We're not going to have the United States establish a religion. There is not going to be an official religion that the United States government supports more than others. And so this is what I kind of explained to you, that citizens were denied their rights if they didn't follow their government's religion. And so our First Amendment protects us from that. Our First Amendment says, oh, no, Congress will not make any laws that respect an established religion. Or in other words, we won't make one religion more superior than any other in this country. Now, there are two reasons that this is actually a good thing, and we already talked about a few of them, but two main reasons for this separation of church and state. Now, let me back up there for a second. That phrase right there, separation of church and state, is nowhere to be found in the Constitution. Our Constitution and the First Amendment, anywhere in the Constitution, it does not say that we have separation of church and state. So if you've ever heard someone say, our Constitution says we have separation of church and state, they're wrong. The Constitution does not literally say that. The Constitution literally says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And it is our Supreme Court, right, the judicial branch, has taken that phrase of the Constitution and said, well, here's what that means. When the Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, our Supreme Court says that means church and state are separate. Or in other words, religion and government are separate. They're two different things, and we're not going to have one be more important than another, and they're not going to, work together necessarily. Okay, so we do have separation of church and state, even though those words aren't in the Constitution. We have that because that's how our Supreme Courts have defined it. It's how they've interpreted the First Amendment. So the first reason is to protect religion. Right? We don't want government leaders telling religious leaders what their religion is all about. I saw this when I was in China in 2008 and 2010. I traveled to China for a couple summers, and I saw that the government actually got to say what preachers and ministers of churches were allowed to say and do. And so the religion was actually being controlled by the government. So that means you could go to church and you wouldn't know if what you're getting is actually from your religion or if it's a message that the government wants to spread, right? So keeping religion and government separate, keeping church and state separate, helps protect religions. It keeps religion from being, or it helps religion stay pure to its actual beliefs, right? And then it also protects the government from being corrupted by religious conflict, right? We've seen a lot of examples throughout history about wars around the world being fought over religion. And if we keep things separate, then religion won't be part of things when war is involved, right? It's just going to be political battles. And so we're actually protecting governments from religion, right? So it's protecting both things from each other by keeping them separate, right? So there's that establishment clause, that part that's in yellow where it says respecting an establishment of religion. What does it really mean? Well, back in 1791, when they passed the Bill of Rights, they didn't know. They just said, you know what, this sounds good. Let's put this in there. Let's say Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And then they're like, so what does that mean? And they're like, just put it in there. And here's why. They knew that religion and culture would be changing as our country's history changed. And so they wanted to make sure that it would be up to the Supreme Courts of today to figure out what that meant for us today. And so we're constantly going back to this phrase and saying, okay, what does this mean to us now? And what does this mean to us now? And then 10 years later, has this changed? Does it mean anything different to us now? Because religions change and ideas change and culture changes. And so our early government leaders allowed for that flexibility. They wanted it to be possible for you to maybe even disagree with what the Constitution was saying and then work through that and then come up with your own interpretation. So when I say your own interpretation, I really mean the Supreme Courts, the judicial branch. They're the ones that get to decide for us today what that phrase means, right? For the free exercise clause, we need to keep in mind that there is the difference between freedom of belief and the freedom to practice your beliefs. So the First Amendment does say Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. But it also says, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That means we won't make laws that prevent you from practicing your religion the way you want to, right? You get to freely exercise your faith. However, there's a difference between believing in something and actually following through with doing it. As you can maybe imagine, there could be a lot of ways that someone might abuse their religious freedom, right? They might do something really, really horrible and say, well, I did it because of my religious beliefs. And that's when the government can step in and say, yeah, you can't do that. You're hurting other people. So you're welcome to believe what you want to believe, but that doesn't mean you actually get to do all those things. And the government has to consider the rights of the individual versus the common good. Of course, the government wants to protect your freedom of religion, and we do care that you get to express your faith and your beliefs the way you want to, but we need to think about everybody else too. And so the government can restrict your religious ideas, or rather your religious actions, not your ideas, if those actions might hurt other people. Here's some examples. Back in several years ago, like a few decades ago, there was a church in Florida that believed that venomous snakes could not harm them because God was protecting them. And so they would actually bring snakes into their worship services, venomous snakes, and they would be handling their snakes while they were worshiping in this church. The government found out about that and said, yeah, you can't do that. And the religion snapped back and said, no, we totally can. We believe we're not being harmed by these snakes because God is protecting us. And there's biblical stuff to back that up. Oftentimes, the devil or Satan is represented by a snake or a serpent in the Bible. And so it was a very meaningful idea and picture to them that these serpents or snakes were not harming them, as if God was protecting them from the devil. It meant a lot to this church community. But the government said, yeah, but there are children in your audience, and someone might get hurt. And so whenever the government steps in, they have to put health, safety, and life over someone's freedom to exercise their religion. So whenever someone's health, safety, or life are in danger, then the government can come in and say, yeah, no matter what you believe, you still can't do that thing. So that church got to remain existing. They just couldn't practice their worship that same way, right? So health, safety, and life always take precedent. Some other freedoms that we get from the First Amendment, or rather that are protected by the First Amendment, these are freedoms we have, but the First Amendment protects them, are freedom of the press, petition, association, assembly, and speech. And these are all kind of different forms of expression. Freedom of the press means that we have news reporters and news agencies and media outlets that are welcome to share what's going on. The press is kind of like the watchdog of our government. Like, they're not part of the government. Like, I've called the judicial branch the watchdog of the government before, but the judicial branch is still in the government. The press, the media, they're not part of the government. So they're really watching. They're really scrutinizing what the government is doing. And so if something bad is happening, the press are going to tell us about it. And we'll be able to say, you can't do that, right? So freedom of the press allows us to share information that's going out there. The right to petition means we have a right to state our feelings in favor of or against the government. If the government is doing something we don't like, we can tell them without going to jail. So freedom of petition gives us a right to speak what's on our mind and to speak out against the government. There's countries around the world where they don't have freedom of petition. And if they speak out against their government, they go to jail or worse, right? So we have the right to petition. We have the right to say, we don't like what's going on, and we can voice our opinions about that. There's freedom of association, which means you can belong to any group. You can be a member of any organization or association, and you are welcome to do that. There's freedom of assembly, which means you have a right to gather with other people in public places, that the government can't restrict you from getting together with people. This is a big deal because during the American Revolution, those Sons of Liberty had to meet in secret because King George and the British soldiers were like spying on them all the time. In reality, it was the Sons of Liberty who were spying on the British, but still they wanted to make sure that they were allowed to gather and have meetings without being punished. And then, of course, there's speech, freedom of speech. You have the right to express your opinions, right? You have the right to say what you want to say. But it is important that we talk about some of those restrictions, right? So there's that acronym PAPAs. I like PAPAs because it reminds us of what freedom of expression is. We've got press, association, petition, assembly, and speech. And freedom of expression is important because we have what's called a representative government, right? Our government needs to follow the will of the people. And the only way that our government knows what the people want is if we're allowed to say it, right? We can't follow the will of the people if the people have to keep their lips shut. So freedom of speech allows us to tell our government leaders what we want them to do. It also gives a voice for non-voters. There's many people who are either too young or maybe their citizenship status doesn't allow them to vote, but they still are protected by the Bill of Rights. They have freedom of speech, even if they can't vote. So voting is one way to, make your voice heard, but so is actually using your voice. That you can tell the government what you want, even if you're not allowed to vote. So this is something that's important for young people to remember. So here's what freedom of speech really means. It does not mean that you can say anything at any time, anywhere, right? You've probably heard that kid in class before. It's like, what? The teacher can't tell me to sit down. I have freedom of speech. I can say what I want. Not true, okay? The reality is there are limits, okay? We do need to have limits on freedom of speech. And here's what those limits are. They're called time, place, and manner restrictions. That there's an appropriate time, there's an appropriate place, and there's an appropriate manner or way that you can express your thoughts. And the middle of class, when the teacher is trying to teach, you can't just interrupt the teacher because you've got 29 other students in there who have a right to their free public education, right? So we need to think about everybody else's rights and not just your own. So there are appropriate times and places and manners that you can exercise your freedom of speech, not just any old time you want to. You also must be peaceable, right? You cannot use hate speech. You cannot incite violence from others, right? That's not the point of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is all about sharing ideas and having an open dialogue about our opinions so that we can improve things, right? The idea is to improve things, not make things worse through violence. Also, if your speech presents a clear and present danger, then the government can shut you down, right? They can say what you're saying is dangerous, what you're doing is dangerous, you could cause harm to yourself or others, so you have to stop. So those are some restrictions that we have on our freedom of speech. And if the government is ever going to restrict your freedom of speech, then they must be protecting a legitimate government interest, such as national security or any other laws that already exist, right? So the government can't just say, I don't like your hair, so no more talking. They have to be protecting a legitimate government interest, and they also can't discriminate. So if they're going to tell one group of protesters that they have to stop, then they have to tell the counter protesters that they have to stop too. The police can't come in and say, well, we like your message, so you can stay, but you all have to leave because we don't like what you're saying. They cannot discriminate. So if they're going to shut down something, they have to shut it all down. If they're going to allow something, they have to allow it all, right? So no discrimination when it comes to restricting our freedom of speech. So there you have it. That's a lot to unpack. Like I told you, the First Amendment is huge. It gives us freedom of speech and all those other forms of expression, as well as freedom of religion, which is hugely important to so many people. But again, probably the big takeaway I want you to remember is that the First Amendment does not give you those rights. You already have those rights because you were born as a human. It's the First Amendment that protects those rights. It spells out those rights so that we know we're guaranteed to have them. Okay, there you go. That is how freedom of religion and freedom of expression are protected by the First Amendment.